Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to have Rob Assise back as a guest on the show. Rob is a jumps coach and math teacher at Homewood Flossmoor High School. He's a writer, a regular speaker at the Track Football Consortium, and he also owns the private training business Re-Evolution Athletics, in addition to his high school coaching duties. It's always fun to talk about the feet, speed, and plyometrics in the scope of any training discussion. On the show today, Rob will be talking about the feet and athletes who are better at sprinting than they are jumping, or vice versa, and what this means on the level of plyometrics and implementation for performance and injury prevention. We also get into speed and power complexes, contrasting energy systems, athlete asymmetry, and so much more. I always love talking to Rob and excited to get this episode going. So let's get to the show here with Rob Assise. Rob, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here again. I was curious too, and I probably could always ask you this, but things you've been working on this past season or seasons for your track athletes, things you've been experimenting with, integrating in your program that are new or interesting, anything that has been of interest in the last couple of years that you've worked with in track?
Sure. I think one big one that we did with the jumpers is I made a pretty big commitment to split sprints this past season, and we really didn't get into them until like the tail end of our indoor season, and then really stuck with them through outdoor. I think it's just a really fantastic stimulus for jumpers, and we've done them. I've used them for years, right? But this was really kind of maybe just a little bit more than in years past, and the results were great. I think the athletes really enjoyed them. And I think it's just a great teaching tool. For the most part, we didn't time them very much. It was just more about a feel. And I think overall, when we started utilizing those, really saw some jumps in performance. And I think if I did one thing well, it was I was patient before I introduced that stimulus. We had a block where we were really focusing on the acceleration of part of the run and some strength. And the results that we were seeing indoors weren't really what we were hoping for across the board. We had a really good group of jumpers, but there wasn't like those big jumps that we're kind of hoping for. But I stay patient with kind of the plan, and once we started introducing those sprint fold sprints, things really started to move in the right direction. So I think it was just good to practice that patience. And then, once I don't know if that was the sole reason why the numbers started to pop, obviously, because there's so many different factors, but it seemed to correlate. So.
Yeah. The sprint float sprints, such a great tool. I when you first said it, I thought you said split sprints. And I was like, what's a split sprint? But I am curious how, well, I'll say just from my own experience, I program those all the time. And it is, I'm curious how you program them, like some of the specs there, in the sense that I know for me as I move to shorter intervals, like instead of like 20, 20, 20 or 30, 30, 30, where it's like sprint 30, float 30, sprint 30, the tighter intervals, like 10, 10, 10 or 15, 15 feel more alive to me. And coming off of those into like a max burst feels really good. And so I'm just curious how you use that either in general or in integration with the runway or helping people up to top speed for their jump, anything there.
Sure. So I think that, the early part of our season, we were doing shorter, just acceleration runs, and then, some fly runs obviously mixed in. So then the introduction was really just like a 25-meter build, like a maximal build. Like I would instruct them, like, I want you to try to be at your top end speed or as fast as you can be by 25 meters. And then we would go into a sprint for 10 initially or 15. And then once we got into introducing the float piece, then I would have them get into a float after that. And then that would be the end of the run. So we did that for a couple sessions. The float would be anywhere from 10 to 20 meters. And then after that, we picked up, after those couple sessions, then we picked back up on a sprint. And And I mean, probably my go-to segmenting would be that 25-meter bill, then a 15 sprint, then 15 float, then 15 sprint. But I definitely tweak that a little bit here and there, just to kind of give them some variation. And I think probably the most impactful way, like when we look at it with incorporating things with the runway, is they would do a sprint float sprint. Usually I would have them rest a good 5 to 6 minutes at least. Sometimes I'd incorporate like an isometric in there as part of kind of the recovery. And then they would go over to the runway and do an approach. And I think that definitely unlocked some maybe self-imposed ceilings that the jumpers had. There was one session I remember, they were we're talking about like, we're at the point of the season where you guys are faster, and your approach number is still 96 feet. And I'm like, I don't think that's right. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, you back up to 100 feet and see what happens. And then they're right on the board, and the run looks good. And they're like, well, how'd you know that was going to happen? And I was like, well, you're accustomed to where you need to be, but we're like 10 weeks into the season, and you're running better. So you're just kind of going through the motions almost in your approach. Let's just see what happens. And pretty much across the board, everyone, their new mark became like, 2 to 3 feet back, which was cool to see.
Yeah, I could totally see that with, especially too, the way the sprint and the float and just like the relaxation and tying it all together. I think people are pretty familiar, at least in the jumps world. And I don't want to make this a totally like jump specific podcast. I just think the general principles are really fascinating, regardless of who you work with just the speed, rhythm, and relaxation. But I think if you've been around the long jump or triple jump area, you always see that athlete who's just super tight, like kind of runs it like a maximal. I think you've called like a blast and a bleed, like just blast the 30 high frequency. And there isn't that like rhythmic relaxation piece. And I mean, it's just so cool too. I think about like, even how does a basketball player run down the court and set up? Is there's always the rhythm piece fundamentally in team sport. And if you're dribbling a ball, but then you go to something like track and it's run as fast as you can, there's a lot of stuff that comes up that can shorten the run up approach for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I often say like the best thing that happened to me as a sprint coach was focusing on the jumps. It just allowed me to kind of see things from a little bit of different perspective, because on the runway, you're really not at maximal speed. So just kind of toggling and getting a little bit more familiar with them and teaching that to athletes has been super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's the thing with track, and even too, like, if it's just, I wanted to ask you too about your general physical preparation, the things, the videos you're showing in your garage, things like that, like all the equipment you have there and the different circuits and the isometrics. But I do think that, yeah, even within track, like, yeah, coaching jumps can have an impact on how you see sprints. Coaching hurdles can have an impact on how you see sprints, and it can have an impact on how you see the jumps. That's the big link, like the two things that I'm working between is seeing the hurdles and the jumps and the hurdles, and even like how there's more propulsion in a hurdle takeoff. I could probably go way too far into that, but I just think the more skills and movements you teach and coach and observe, the more the whole picture can kind of make sense to you over time. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's definitely interesting to hear your take on that with the sprint float sprints for sure. Did you say, you were saying it was the sprint float sprints out of the sprinting events that worked its way into the jumps for you, or was it the other way around?
I think going back 20 years when I started, we were doing, I was in charge then of like sprints and hurdlers and high jump primarily, but we were doing sprint float sprints then. So I think it was, sprint float sprints were just something that, sprinters, jumpers, and hurdlers were doing. But this was just more like I was going to focus more on this with the jumpers this past season.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a great thing to work with. It too. Do you do anything? Not to make this too jump specific. I think too, like this could be specific to any takeoff though, and the way the rhythm goes. Like if you go for a dunk approach in basketball. But do you do anything at high jump with modulating, like any pieces of the curve, like the middle of the curve, doing like throwing bounds in or floating there in different ways? Or is that just I mean, it is such a short distance. It's kind of your float is like, hey, for 3 steps, do this, So, but anything there that you work in there?
I think I definitely introduced variation. This past season, I had athletes who were really unique or new to the event. So they kind of had some variation built in, I'd say,
Yes,
especially in the curve. So we were kind of really trying to dial that in. But for the more experienced ones, I think we'll definitely throw in some things just to almost get them like out of their head a little bit. And there were things that we would do periodically just to change up the rhythm. But for the most part, this past season, I'd say it was pretty specific to just trying really just what our group this year needed to work on was just not internally rotating the feet too much while they were in their curve. So, like their foot placement wasn't really matching their upper body really well. So it was kind of like a fake curve run where they weren't really putting good forces down in the ground. So that's what we really dialed into this past season.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like Rob Gray had talked about a while back on like motor learning and variability is there's good variability and bad variability. And a beginner, basically I hate using words that don't necessarily mean, that aren't concrete or easy to, or simple. That's the word I'm looking for. But like the attractors aren't established, or basically those key fundamental components of technique aren't nailed down. And it's like, yeah, variability at that point before those main points are established isn't really going to be that helpful in many senses. At least I think, yeah, and like hey, we're going to manipulate the rhythm now, but I don't even know how to run a curve yet. Well, still, yeah, once you have that, I do think it is a lot of fun to explore and play with. But I definitely I hear you with that for sure. With the you mentioned complexes, and this was something we had talked about back a while ago. I don't remember if it was 1 podcast ago or 2 podcasts ago. We were just talking about things like, hey, what if you played basketball and then went and did jumps? Like, which is basically what happens when you play pickup and dunk between games. And what if you took that into track? And I was curious, you mentioned doing like circuits with sprint float sprints and then the takeoffs and then some ISO holds. Have you done any experiments with some of the shorter jumps, like short jumps, and then go run like a 120 or a 150 or something like that? Make them go run the 110 hurdles and come back. Like, do you anything of that nature where you're contrasting that short explosive system and then that longer, more rhythmic or getting into the metabolic area system?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some of my favorite stuff, and I was actually debriefing with an athlete after season, and he said that those are like his favorite to do as well. So yeah, longer run, mix in an ISO, do something, maybe, some sort of like med ball throw or something dynamic there, and then come over and do some short approach work, whether it's longer triple jump related. I think those are absolutely fantastic. And for me personally, like when I do something like that, I just feel great.
Yes.
But I also know like I don't want to have that bias what they're doing, but like to hear that feedback from the athlete, like was cool. So yeah, they I think collectively the majority of them enjoy that kind of circuit style. And that for me really came down to just a management piece of having one pit with at times 25 jumpers. Like I just had to break things up a little bit and have them do other stuff. If this was the specific day where we were going to have access to the pit. So it kind of just came out just from like the necessity of management. And then, sometimes you just discover those things, and yeah, they really enjoy those.
Yeah. I think it kind of highlights too, in so many ways, like an elastic athlete, a jumper. And you think about like playing basketball or football, even like there's a lot of volume in those games, or soccer or whatever. Like you watch Ronaldo and jumps so high and runs all over the place. And it kind of fits with, you can handle this volume or more, but if you contrast it, it just makes it feel so easy because the long thing that you did, I mean, it's not like you're running like a 400 and blasting it. Although I feel like for some athletes, you could probably do close to that. They get like 20 minutes to come back, if you had forever.
Sure.
But it does, like some of those longer sprints do just feel really good. And it's because it feels good. And then you jump well after, it's motivating. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, if I felt that good after that, I'll go do another one, And I think it just highlights how much volume that some athletes can handle, especially like elastic athletes, and how that can be a good thing for you.
Yep. Yeah, I think, in general, when you kind of think about volume, like when there's variety mixed into it, right? You could do things forever. I feel like at times, so I think that's like I don't know, volume gets crapped on a lot, but if you're doing things that are, I wouldn't say like segmented, but like just where you have a variety of tasks mixed in, I think, the biggest limiter in volume is like your perception from your brain perspective, right? So like when you do things that the brain finds interesting, your brain doesn't give a damn about volume.
Yes. I was just going to say, as long as it's interesting, like and that's where I even think sometimes too about, like when I was at Wisconsin lacrosse, when I was in graduate school, this was like 2007, and they had won like all these national championships. So they had the banners all over the place, and it was a school that ran. I think there was a lot of inspiration from Clyde Hart, and it was like 8x200, but they made that 8x200 interesting. It was like very traditional. They would run in the outside lane. There'd be a leader. There's precision because they're trying to hit a certain time, and it's all like planned. I mean, I'm not saying like yeah, 8x200 and 10x200, it's the best. But they found that if you did it in that system, it was fundamentally interesting, and the way it was laid out. And yeah, the longer I've gone through this, especially if you look at, I think sometimes too, when we spend a lot of time on the track or in the weight room and with very things that are more systemic in nature and planned, and then you just go play a sport, it's just funny to sometimes look at how your mind is experiencing higher levels of fatigue than you would get in most track workouts. Like when I play ultimate frisbee or things like that, or if you go play soccer, and it's like, wow, this is intense. and the way, how is my brain perceiving this? And it's fun. There's not like, you're not in I'm in like a survival mode about the next sprint type of thing. It's right. The perception is so huge.
Yeah, you're tired, but you want to keep going.
Yeah. I like watching I think Travis Hunter from Colorado, who does like a two-way player, plays offense and defense. And they say, I think the coaches or the sports scientists are like, his data, his workloads, like player loads or whatever, are like just totally off the charts. But if you look at the guy, like he's so like happy, you can just tell like he must perceive that as just this joyful experience. All the volume is just this. It makes me think about what Tony Holler says about a base of joy. Like if joy is your base, like you can do it, and maybe there's probably more to it than that, but I do think there's something to it with that, and how all that volume and play is being perceived by the body because of how the mind's perceiving it.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah. With some of those circuits, and I think it's one thing for track, like, okay, like let's do some jumps and let's go do some 150s or 200s. I think for a team sport athlete, they may not see it the same way as a track athlete. If you said, "Hey, let's go run a fast 200 real quick," and they might. What's your take on? Do you use more like ISO holds for a general team sport athletes? Like, how's your thought on contrasting those systems with the team sport population?
I think like for the athletes I see on like the private side, it's really kind of individualized to their needs. So, and it really just depends on what specific trait we're trying to address, and then what the focus of that day would be. So, I mean, I can give like an example. I have an athlete who she's super fast. I mean, sub 24 in the 200, high school athlete. So, she can move, and her gift is max velocity. Like she's a max velocity champion. But she also is a lacrosse player. And, her gift on the field is she's just faster than everybody, but, wants to build in some capacities for change of direction and a little bit better acceleration. So like one of our sessions recently, we did like a overcoming isometric, like in a split squat stance. We went to a altitude drop, landing in a split stance. So kind of like from the old was the Chris and Dan videos, I know that was in there. So you're landing that drop in a split stance. From there, she did a run on a shred mill. So a power focus, like what we would call gear 2, where they're going to hit they're in like an acceleration position and hitting somewhere between 50 and 60% of max velocity, pretty high resistance. And then after that, a split squat on the K box, and probably like 6 to 8 reps there on each leg, and went through that about 4 times. So kind of addressing different areas on the like force velocity curve, I suppose, was kind of one of the focuses there. But I think, overall was something like, it was a challenging workout for her for sure. But something that like she was invested in and found value in.
Yeah, I was going to ask with the complexes, because I was just having this conversation with Dan Fichter and Chris Corfist recently. Was complexes, you mentioned the sprint float sprint complexes with jumping. I think off season it always makes perfect sense. The complexes and trying to blend qualities together to expose the body to new forms of either stimulation or fatigue, and then that newfound variability to help spearhead the adaptation. And it's interesting, like we talked about. It's something that's just, if you perceive the workout a certain way, it is very interesting. But I was going to ask you, like I asked them, okay, do you always sprint in complexes? When do you not? When do you just run fly 10s? For you, how do you view that? Like, let's just take jump training, like long jump, for example. Pretty similar to like just a straight sprint. Of course, you have a jump at the end. But what's your thought on the ratio of working in complexes there to just, hey, we're just going to go just take jumps on the runway and get in line, and that kind of thing?
Sure. I think for me, when we're doing like approach rehearsal, I will have, like if we're mixing, like maybe during the course of a week, we'll have a session where that approach rehearsal is mixed in with a complex. And then there'll be a session where it's just approach rehearsal. And so like in that complex day, maybe they get anywhere from 4 to 5 approaches. On the day where we're just focusing on approach rehearsal, they can take, anywhere from 8 to 10. So that would probably be how I look at it, for the most part. Usually when we do like the shorter stuff, I do have that in some sort of complex in season. So when it's like, I guess you could view it as more of a sub-maximal sort of jump day. Usually there's a variety of tasks within that particular session.
Yeah. So in some ways, would you say you like having kind of like one day that's just more serial, just doing the thing repeatedly, and then one day that's more like a variability day?
Yes.
Yeah. I like that. I like that system a lot. I think it's just a good balance, And yeah, because it's sometimes, I think it's easy to get carried away with both sometimes in a way. Like you could just get carried away with, hey, we're just doing fly 10s, and just maxing out whatever the time is, and just get in line and try again and try faster. But it's like the complex lets your brain kind of ease off of that a little bit. Sometimes it's almost like you can almost have a complex as an excuse. Oh, there's other stuff in here, so I don't maybe have to be at, maybe I'm at 98% and it's okay instead of 100. But it's still like the totality of the stimulus makes that serial or singular better. It's like, it's almost different mental frames too, like you talked about perception.
Yeah, absolutely. And another cool thing, like too, is with having Chris on staff, and he's a lot of times operating his 1080 with our top sprinters. I will send, during, if it's a day where we're doing some sort of complex with the approaches where it's not the sprint float sprint, I can send them over to Chris to do a rep or two, and then they come back. So even having just like, being with a different coach, I think leads to a different experience. So kind of bouncing back and forth between the two of us, I think is a unique experience too.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really cool coaching situation when there's that lever or dial in the ecosystem. I remember because I had not really seen this before in track. So, I mean, I had just come from a D3 school with less coaches, at Wilmington College back in my 20s. And then at Cal, there was more, of course, a track program with much more coaches on staff. But even still, I didn't, and this was just my observations as a strength coach. And of course, you have to share athletes periodically, like hurdles and sprints and relay handoffs, or, long jump occasionally going with sprints, things like that. But when I started working with swim, especially like the men's program there, it was so interesting looking at, because you had the two main coaches, and you had a coach emeritus who would come in, I think, and work with the breaststrokers periodically. But Dave Durden was the head coach there, and he was the 2020 or 2021 Tokyo head coach for the swimming. And it was just so interesting to see how he would pass athletes between, he ran the sprints, and then Yuri Sugiyama was like mid-distance and distance. And just to see how, some athletes were sprints all the time, some athletes were just distance, but then other athletes would trade off. But for those athletes that traded groups, like you said, like it's not just the sets and reps, it's also the person who's overseeing coaching, the personality, like kind of the vibe of that person. And if you have those levers to pull, I do think, that as part of the managerial piece of it all, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that can happen. And yeah, and as well too, I know people talk about like track athletes who go stagnant and then they switch coaches. And as soon as they switch coaches, they just start doing great again. And you might say, well, was it really that the new coach was that much better than the old coach? Or is all this novelty, not just in the workup, but the training environment and the personality of the coach and the training and everything, So I think that novelty is such a cool thing if you have the ability to, in your system to work with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, one thing, I did want to ask this too. You mentioned that a lacrosse player, women's lacrosse, and a really good sprinter. I've thought about this a little bit with like the arms and rotation and swinging motions in the upper body and then sprinting. Do you feel like lacrosse players have any sort of different sprint tendencies than just like a regular, I guess, track athlete or someone who doesn't run with a stick in their hand? Because I think about too, like David Weck talked about like apocalypto, and if you run with a spear in your hand, it's a little different, or how humans are meant to have tools. Anything you notice there? Because I haven't spent much time watching lacrosse players run, let alone like a lacrosse player who also does track. But I was curious if you just noticed anything there from that.
I haven't, and she's the only lacrosse player I've worked with. So yeah, I haven't. I mean, she's fundamentally sound from a track perspective, I would say. So yeah, I haven't really noticed anything. But it would be cool, and maybe I'll do this like to timer, with and without the lacrosse stick, and see what happens, or get some outputs on the 1080 with that, and see what the difference is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if running with a lacrosse stick was like the thing and sprinting, then all lacrosse players would just come up the track and be lightning, right? Like, there's never a 1-to-1 magic bullet. I'm always just curious if somebody who has more, I guess, constant feedback in the hands and upper body because of the nature of their sport, if there's something different that shows up in the running gait on result of that. But I guess every tool too is how you use it. I'm sure different lacrosse players probably, even like you watch pole vault, and one of my favorite videos is watching Mondo, the world record holder in pole vault. In high school, he just ran the 100 and ran 10.5. I'm like, that is fast. And there is that, like, he's got this kind of like asymmetrical gait, like because when you hold like a 16-foot pole, of course you're going to have an asymmetrical gait because you're holding it to one side. Right. But it was interesting to see some of that pole vault gait show up in his sprinting, and I couldn't help but wonder. I wonder if that actually might have made him a little bit faster, because 10.5 is, for a pole vaulter, is very fast, and especially he's kind of like a skinny dude. Like, he looks kind of like he could be a high jumper, So it's just interesting to see that. Always curious.
Yeah, and I will say one thing that is interesting about this athlete is she does have asymmetry. So looking at like a right-left report from the 1080, and she also did long jump. So she jumps off her right foot, but looking at the data from the 1080, her left puts out more force, and it's about like 12 to 13% is what I've seen on a few different runs. So kind of interesting. Could it be with, the extended amount of time with the lacrosse stick in hand? I don't know. It's interesting something that we've been kind of addressing, but maybe that could be part of the reason we see that.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Today's podcast is sponsored by my favorite jump testing and training device, the Plyomat. If you want a jump mat that can not only get standard counter movement jumps and reactive jumps, but also is something you can put into your standard plyometric training, such as hurdle hops and bounds, to gather not only height, but reactive strength, contact time, and add that extra dynamic to your total training session, then check out the Plyomat, and you can head to plyomat.net, that's plyomat.net, to learn more. Yeah, I had a question about asymmetry. So yeah, if we could get to that, I think it'd be interesting to cover. And I'm sure it's stuff that, outside of the 1080, I'm sure you could certainly see it, in the stride. And it probably is a thing too, where once you see it on the 1080, it's like, oh, I'll look at the stride with new eyes now. And now what do you see? But I guess in lacrosse, and I'm not that familiar with lacrosse, but I would imagine if you're throwing in your right-handed thrower, there's a lot of like planting on the left leg, the same way maybe you kick a soccer ball or swinging a baseball bat, and there's a braking action and internally rotating action on the left leg. And I don't know, I'm just curious. Yeah, maybe that works its way in there somehow. But it's always interesting how athletes choose and find ways to work around that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with the asymmetry, then, what are things you've been noticing on that? Like, is there a point where you are like, okay, this is not good, let's try to do something, or it's like, oh, this is good, like I see you're using a little bit of this and you're really fast and you're not injured, and those kind of things? Yeah, just any thoughts on the asymmetry that you're seeing in athletes and where you're going with it?
Yeah. So in general, like, my expectation isn't for symmetry. I think that's not realistic, and I think at the end of the day, for a lot of sports specific events, like it's like valuable to, like, for me, like I'm way better at jumping off my left leg. And if I really focused on trying to get as good on my right leg, I would be taking away from that like maximal capacity that I have on my left, so I wouldn't want to do that. So I think, one, you got to take into account the task at hand. But just in general, when we're looking at it with like gait or, like something like bounding, hopping, whatever, I usually just use like a 10% marker. So like if that asymmetry is greater than 10% or maybe approaching 10%, maybe we're going to tease in some things to try to get a little bit more of a balance. So that's the marker that I've been using. I've had some athletes with like the 1080 report where there's like a 30% difference, and it's like, well, this is not good. Yeah. And you can see it, like that one, I'm watching them run and I'm like, yeah, I can see that. It's pretty obvious. But that would be one where it's like, yeah, man, we gotta make some adjustments here, because I think that's with, beyond the boundary that I'm comfortable with. It could be kind of a ticking time bomb there. Yeah. But like, I like addressing it, I'm not doing anything too crazy. It might be like an extra set of a particular exercise, or maybe a little bit more volume. Or if I go if it's like a bilateral day, maybe they'll do something unilateral on that weaker leg. So it's not like something that I'm trying to fix like today. It's just inserting some things over the course of time to kind of try to become a little bit more balanced.
Yeah, I do think with those asymmetries, trying to, if you look at it like layers of an onion, that asymmetry is like the most outside layer you're seeing, and it's happening because of all these inner layers of the onion. Like you said, working at it from more of a strength or a structural perspective. I do think there's probably structure that's become that way because, like, maybe if you're playing football and you're always running with the ball in one hand or something, or a lot, or whatever it is. Like, I was just thinking about I was thinking about doing an Instagram video on this. I never did, but like Jacoby Ford was one of the, if you watch those videos where it's like the fastest 1040s of all time, or I don't know if he still is, but he ran a 4.28 and he had a really externally rotated type athlete. And if you watch him on the field, super asymmetrical, like 1 foot. And Adarian Barr talks about like up leg and down leg. And I think a lot of the asymmetry, the functional and good asymmetry we see is a result of the interaction of those legs working well. But this guy, I mean, it was like super heel strike on 1 foot and then maybe more of a 4 foot on the other. And I think maybe a little bit was ball carrying or whatever, but there was definitely something structural that was pretty substantial, and then a motor program that was real strong. And I think he was pretty injured, like over, I think he was really fast, but it's also funny to see those athletes who are, actually even just looking at, I'm like, quick Google search. Yeah. Foot injuries, out with foot injury again. So I wonder if that, that asymmetrical stride may have led to that over time. It's interesting to look at those layers, like what's good, what's excessive. But the thing that always impresses me is just how fast someone can be with some of those, even if it was like something that you end up getting a little bit hurt from, just how good the body is at solving problems. But yeah, 10%, it's amazing to think about 30%. I wonder if that guy was at 30% or, it'd be interesting to see the video overlay of something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. So you said you like single leg stuff. Do you do like only working one leg? Like if, for example, if somebody was like lacking power on a single leg versus the other, you would do like extra work on that one leg, or could you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. So like if we're doing, let's just say like submaximal hopping, maybe I would do, if we're doing maybe 3 sets for 20 yards and the right leg was weaker, maybe they would do 4 on the right. So still hopping on both legs, but just kind of teasing that in over time. Usually what like I'll do, oftentimes I will complex a plyometric with an isometric. So it would be, do an isometric, do a plyometric. So they would do maybe a set more on that weaker leg of the isometric and the plyometric.
Gotcha. Have you, I know Chris has talked about using like Lila Exogen asymmetrically, like only on one leg. Have you ever done anything with that and seen the readout changes?
That I like with this, I haven't yet. Okay. And that's definitely somewhere that I want to go. I used the Exogen a lot this past winter on the shred mill. So and there at times I would do the asymmetrical, but I wasn't getting like any feedback other than what the runners would say. But one thing that was interesting with that is a lot of times they would actually be faster with the weights on. Like they would put out a higher number on the shred mill, which I guess from a physics standpoint kind of makes sense. And it wasn't across the board, but I would say the majority did. But like the weight was like kind of in that happy medium where there's you can move that. It's kind of like helping that limb move faster.
I totally agree. Yeah, it is interesting where it's like there's clearly a point where there's too much and it slows you down. But then you eventually get this point where, and I wouldn't have thought of this right when I started using the micro weights. At first, I was just thinking, oh, huge hamstring overload. And then I eventually started to realize, wow, if you put these things on, and even in like a little bit of a spiral, because I think that little bit of spiraling helps the way that the body manages the extension of the swing leg and things. And it's like, wow, I actually feel faster on this. Like, this is cool because it almost like gives you that little extra oomph in particular vectors. And one thing I was thinking of, anyone who, if one day, maybe we can hang out someday and I'll have to try this out. But for me, like my hips are shifted to the right and my right leg is more externally rotated. It doesn't pronate as well as my left. And if I put Exogen on in a spiral pattern to internally rotate that right leg, I feel so much more power off my right foot when I run. So anyways, I would love to see those types of things quantified. I'd be curious if, and honestly, I do think Rhett Larson had posted something about Lila Exogen, and Joe talks about Dulcetti talks about the future being light. I kind of feel like at some point there's going to be a lot more integration with that kind of thing, where it's like you have an athlete, and on one end, it's like, oh, is it going to be just a pure data dystopia where you're just a number, and it's just, all right, this is your pattern, here's your intervention, and there's not really, this creative, intuitive process. But like, I could see the helpful piece being like, all right, here's your asymmetry, here's a specific like Lila patterning that maybe fits with your body type, if you're a particular, posture type or whatnot. And, that I think it'd be really interesting, at least. I think it's coming. And so, yeah, anyways, down the road, I'm really curious to see whatever you might find there in the future.
Yeah. And I would say I'm the same with the right foot, in the hips. So when I do kind of spiral that teardrop down, like along the front of my shin, I definitely feel better when I run. So I'll have to put myself on the 1080 and see what it says.
Yeah, tell me, please. That's sort of something too. I almost feel like even like I know corrective exercise and biomechanics is really expanding. Like with the Bill Hartman's work and PRI and all the offshoots of all that stuff. And I wonder. I think on one end, it's like, okay, doing things where it's like, okay, you're getting on the ground or you're side lying and you're working on breathing. I think obviously there's a lot of value, and that's like the core of where a lot of those compensations come from. But I also wonder how much you could get just strapping something on and running with it, and just from a pure stimulus perspective too, how much stimulus you get, over and how explosive that stimulus is over time. I think I like doing all of it, but it's interesting to think, could you turn a right oblique back to the left just by steering, the exogen, steering your hips the other way and just running a lot? Maybe I'll have to try. But I like that we're probably both, I think we're both narrow elastics who probably compressed ourselves at some point squatting or deadlifting. So we both, we have good turn to the right now.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to ask this, you had a post on this. This was actually one of the main things I wanted to get to. And you had made this post in response to something Eric Guthrie had said on reactive strength index. And yeah, you just had some really interesting takes on RSI and basically like a fast RSI and what it means for sprinting and jumping. Can you go into what you had said there in that post? I think it was really fascinating on the reactive strength and its relationship to how we intervene on an athlete for sprint and jump outcomes.
Sure. So I think like RSI in general, like it gives a metric, which, if you can get a metric from something, you can measure some improvement. What does it really tell us from a track coach's perspective? I mean, like our fastest sprinters have the best RSI score. So do I need to do a rebound jump test with them to know they're going to be, have a quality RSI score? Probably not. But, in those traditional tests, they're more forefoot dominant, and, sprinting is a more forefoot dominant. So it kind of makes sense. So what I really wanted, especially when I started working with jumpers, started looking more like at just how the foot interacts with the ground, and within the jumps, the last couple steps in most are going to be more of the flat or rolling type. So I've had jumpers and sprinters who have had crazy good RSI scores, and it's like, okay, we need them to be able to, we want to try them out in the jumps, and they come over to the jumps, and I'll have them like bound or hop, and they're going to have a contact that's more flat or rolling, and they just can't do it. Like it looks like incredibly labored. It's like they just don't want to. They almost refuse to contact that rear part of their foot. So you kind of make note of that. You're like, okay. And a lot of times it's like, all right, well, maybe jumping's not for you. And that's kind of how I dealt with it early. It's like, okay, this is, those last two steps in long jump are going to be for the most part flat or rolling. Maybe this isn't, you're already really good at sprinting, so let's just keep you sprinting. And then what I noticed with them over the course of time is, those athletes who struggle accessing that rear part of their foot, they were more prone to hamstring injuries. And I'm not entirely sure why, but it's just something like over the course of time you kind of notice. And I can think of like 4 off the top of my head right now. So I don't know if that's like if we look at something more like bounding, where uh, it's like a power bound, you're going to get that flatter rolling contact, and the hip extension that occurs afterwards is that more like uh, because you can do that, you're training that hip extension pattern, and it's kind of making you more resilient to those hamstring type injuries, or um, yeah, that's kind of where I guess my thoughts are with it. It's just kind of interesting uh, for that connection to be there. And I'd be interested if more coaches of that, where those athletes just kind of refuse to access the full part of their foot. On the flip side of it, the athletes who struggle with the RSI, they struggle to bounce. They tend to be not that great at sprinting. So usually what'll happen is if you expose them to that RSI, like the bouncing kind of exposure, that will help them. You can kind of see their sprinting and those RSI time or RSI metrics kind of rise together. And the nice part of that is maybe you can't sprint super often, 2 to 3 times a week, but you can mix in those bouncing sessions and some maximal plyometrics to kind of assist that along the way.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. The whole thing, an example that's in my head with like bounding and RSI and forefoot. And there was just a great podcast I just recorded with Andrew Paul talking about forefoot and rear foot dominant elastic athletes in basketball, and how a lot of it has to do with even like just their basic structure and how it fits even with how they might prefer how to squat. And I think with Chris, I know Chris Korfus had talked about like back in the day, back in the 2000s, I don't know if this was like a Frank Dick thing with the UK sprints, but like it was like a correlation between bounds and your sprint times and things like that. And Chris had all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And then later he said, well, I kind of went away from bounding and sprinting because I think basically it's like it's too slow. It's like it's more flat footed. It's not like the pop of sprinting, which that makes sense. It's like what you're saying. Like sprinting is a very propulsive movement, and to bound with a full foot, it's not. There's both absorption and propulsion, but you have to be good at absorbing to bounce or to bound with a full foot, I should say. So it seems to me like the hamstring injuries, I'd be curious your take on this, but a part of it might be just it's rate of force development and lack of options. Like, it's like anytime you're riding the razor's edge, well, hey, I'm going to be maximally propulsive and with not a whole lot of options to get in the rest of the foot. And I'm also very fast. I mean, have become fast like this. But I guess the question is then, well, what do you do with those athletes? Do you make them like land flat-footed, which is not their superpower, obviously? Do you do things in the weight room to give them more pronation and access to midfoot, like heels elevated, like Hatfield squats and things like that? Yeah, I'd be curious because I think this is things we're just starting to learn more about in some perspective. I think for the longest time, traditionally, track coaches have said, flat foot contacts. And for me, I tend to do things that don't force things as much as possible. So I like starting with like backwards to like hopping because then it's a lot easier to get a forefoot contact or a midfoot without feeling you're forcing it. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that or any follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to. So from where I'm at with it now is just for the athlete that struggles with the rear foot, midfoot, just trying to give them exposure to being able to do it. So. And like you said, like not forcing. So like one that I think is pretty good at like getting them to feel it on the rear foot is just like simple galloping.
Yeah.
Very few people are going to hit a 4-foot contact gallop. So that's one way. But yeah, I would say like not being intentional, like, hey, I need you to jam your heel into the ground, mm-hmm. right? Like giving them just some exposure to that, and then progressively working way up to something that would be a little bit more of a intense demand.
Just a quick break from the show to let you know this podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen wearable resistance gear. It's an incredible product, and if you want to get 25% off, you can head to lilateam.com and use the code JustFly25. That's JustFly and the number is 25 for that 25% off. Great product. Hope you can check that out. Let's get back to the show. I really like the galloping piece because the one thing that's always felt a little weird to me with like the midfoot plyometric thing is it's almost a different plyometric than now be fast and explosive. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like it's a constraint to get this thing, but now you're no longer as reactive as you could be. And so the gallop to me seems like, well, it's a natural thing because, we watch kids crawl, then they walk, then they're running pretty soon after that. And then they're galloping usually because it's fun, but it's also like this, it's almost like the way that children are searching for rhythm. And it's because it's so natural, you don't even have to necessarily force things. I guess you could say, there's usually one foot, and, speaking of asymmetry, a gallop's asymmetrical. There's one foot that's more the down leg and one that's more the up leg. And just working through that, I think, it's a good natural way to approach it without like kind of taking away an athlete's superpower in a way. I think you could also probably have them do squatty gallops, squat, then you have to be more flat-footed. Yeah. Even squatty running is an interesting one because you kind of, it's more about the angular piece of the leg, like the angular velocities of the legs. But to do it well, you kind of have to have, it helps to be able to be a little bit more flat-footed for a brief moment in time, just because there's that, to squat down and move, you kind of have to have that piece of it. And athletes who are really shoved forward in a late stance, you could say, which, being propulsive has its, there's obviously good things of propulsion, but if you don't have the option of midfoot access, that can be a really difficult thing for a lot of people. And you almost have to find something else for them, a different way for them to experience that. It's probably the great question. It's probably the great running question of track, at least for a long time. But I guess strength and conditioning probably gets that a little bit more in the weight room, I think. Like, the heels elevated type squatting and things, and helping people feel and reference the heels more and stuff like that. So I was going to say with the different crossover track events, one thing that I may have mentioned this on the podcast at some point, but it was something like where it was in high jump. I think it might have been with Andrew Paul recently, or maybe I was writing about it, but someone had asked Javier Sotomayor, the world record holder in high jump. I think it was a aspiring high jumper who had run the 200, and he was like, I ran like 21 something or 22 flat. And Sotomayor was like, too fast. That's too fast for high jump. But I think what he's probably getting at is high jump is more of a rear foot elastic thing. Like you plant on the lateral aspect of your heel. Like you have to be able to spiral energy through your whole foot. And obviously you need to be good through your forefoot too. You need to be extremely explosive there. But it's almost like if you're too propulsive, that could be a problem with being able to use that like rear foot into forefoot while you're spiraling upwards and things like that. And I know for me, like I was always a much better jumper. Like my best jumps was long jump or high jump, my best, then triple jump, like definitely above average, long jump, quite average. And it was just, and as I've looked through it, different lenses, yes, it was speed, but what about that speed? Well, a lot of it was just forefoot propulsion. And like, even when I ran hurdles, like my coaches were like, I need to have a tighter swing leg. And I had like a soccer kick more swing leg in hurdling. And a lot of it was because the way I high jumped was so absorbing, like just like absorb, kick the ground, like I'm bounding, And so these days, actually, just a lot of it's just for fun. I'll hurdle and intentionally try to be as propulsive as possible just to work the opposite quality, just to get that. It's almost like I have to squat down a little bit and let myself really achieve more forefoot. And anyways, not to turn it into Joel's, 40-year-old hurdling dreams. But I would always lose. When I was in high school, I would be great over the first 4 hurdles and be with people. And then they'd start kicking my butt. Everyone else would pull away hurdles 4 through 10 because they were just more propulsive over them. They just have more forefoot dominance, and I'm still absorbing on so I could never like pick up speed. It was kind of funny. So yeah, it's there's a lot of good stuff with the foot there. With the plyos too. Well, one, if there's any other thoughts you had on that with like bounds and plyos, and I think that's why Chris went to like flex leg bounds and prime times, because those are more propulsive ways to bound. Like you're not really like a prime time straight leg bound. You're not really using your whole foot. It's still more the outside edge of the forefoot. Even flex leg bound might be a little more midfoot, but it's still in that more propulsive ballpark. But then you get into like regular traditional bounds, and it's all the way through.
Mhm.
So yeah, I actually, maybe before I ask you about your plyo post, did you have any thoughts on like your integration of those things into that equation, the flex leg and straight leg bounding?
Those are definitely things that we'll use for sure. And yeah, I think it's mostly foot related. If you just think about by bringing the knee forward, you're going to you have to have kind of more foot work within that. You're gonna be more propulsive, as you say, off of that. So those are definitely things. And I think at the end of the day, just manipulating those variables and giving athletes exposure to those different type of contacts, I think just makes them more resilient for sure, and gives them more options.
Yeah. Yeah. Treating it more like, I think about, basketball, soccer, you feel so good playing basketball, going into dunking, but then you go to track and let's just bound this way and do it just this way. You do one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But versus giving athletes a lot of ways to use their feet in the scope of a bound. Definitely
Mm-hmm.
more robust, to use a trendy word, and a really dynamic experience. So last question I have for you here, Rob. You had said something about how most plyos shouldn't be maximal, a hill you will die on. Very, aggressive statement. What's your thoughts on that one?
I think that plyometrics in general it's probably at least for me the most difficult type of exercises to perform, to especially within a group trying to meet athletes where they are. So I think it has to be effective. It really has to be individualized. And at times, I think when we look at plyometrics just in general, people just think, oh, it has to be all out, like maximal effort. And I think you lose a lot if that's all you do. And again, this is biased based on the athletes that I coach, our primary high school kids. But you see so many athletes who are just trying to grind out a plyometric. And that's usually not a good strategy to be effective. I mean, they just look so stiff, and they're putting out all this effort, but the return is just minimal. There's no bounce out of it. So I think that's where that the extensive or low intensity, medium intensities really just teach them rhythm, and then once you have that rhythm established, you really start to see those maximal tests start to rise. So we could get into the whole idea, for more sedentary and all that, and maybe that's why they don't have great rhythm when they're going through and doing some of the more maximal plyos. That's I'm sure part of the reason, but I think there's just so many benefits to really just being fluid and contracting and relaxing well, and interacting with the ground, that can be found when you're working at a submaximal intensity.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think the thing with plyometrics, it's an exercise designed to assist all the main sports skills: sprinting, jumping, throwing, cutting. And of course, all the main skills already happen in sport in a very competitive, timed up to reactive stimuli situation. And I think we're so tuned to just doing things for the force and the outputs and the magnitudes. And like we even just talked about, you could get really good at maximal bounding, but it might not tie into the propulsive element of sprinting as much as you were hoping to. And there's also things beyond just the force. There's the fluidity. It's like the tuning between tendon and muscle and the way the whole body works with and carries elastic energy. And there's a structure that comes with that too. I think if you do that a lot, there's benefits to the way your whole structure attunes itself, and it can go in other things. So yeah, I know I've personally made the mistake, and I think it's reflected in the way I program now. Is I used to be, it was just about depth jumps and maximal bounds back for me, 20 years ago or even 15 years ago, because those are, Well, if you played basketball all season and you have a good base, well, you can do those things and you'll see improvements. But I think the question is, well, if you keep doing it that way, how long are you going to keep seeing improvements? And what's your movement quality going to be like? And what's your forefoot propulsion going to look like? And those things. So yeah, on those elements, I certainly agree with you. Do you, I mean, I'd assume obviously for like your jumping events, you do like, there's various maximal plyometric tests, like 5 bounds off your left leg and right leg. I'm assuming you still do those. It's just when you actually train the plyos, it's a lot more about the rhythmic piece than it is like, how far did you go on this series? You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I still love testing plyometrics maximally for sure. So yeah, we usually have like we'll do progressive, like for a bound test, we'll do like 6 bounds. We'll start from a stationary start, and then we'll have an approach into that. We'll do things with hopping for sure. So yeah, absolutely, we'll test those, and usually for me, it's like I'd say every other week to once every 3 weeks, just kind of depending on our schedule. Because I do want to know, like I need to know if we're making progress, right?
Yeah.
So. But then between those sessions, I mean, the majority of it is going to be submaximal. There might be something teased in. And the other thing that we got to keep in mind during a track season is, if the athlete's a triple jumper, that's a maximal event. So,
yeah. Yes.
I'm not going to, have them have 3 maximal plyometric sessions within the course of a week. So I think the placement of those maximal sessions is important. Keeping in mind that within track and field, a high jumper is going to have a maximal session where they might have 12 jumps. The triple jumper, may have to take 6 jumps. So, yeah, I think it's just, kind of teasing those items in, and where appropriate is great. And, we monitor them, we see if they're improving. But just based on like our schedule with potentially 2 to 3 meets per week, if we want to have a plyometric session, it really only just makes sense for it to be submaximal.
Yeah. And then for general athletic population, I'm assuming it's even more so really because they're not triple jumpers by nature.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me just a little bit about your integration there, like movements you like, combos you like, and then your approach, what you're communicating to the athletes on the purpose of what they're doing.
Really, there. I mean, it's very introductory, and it's kind of what we've talked about already. Where I'm going to give them different options to work with their feet, and I think, for like that field court sport athlete, I think learning how to bound and have their full foot on the ground there's definitely a direct carryover to anything that's change of direction. Yeah. So I think that's good exposure for them there. But then, also things where it might be a little bit more forefoot dominant with like a speed bound, or even if we're just dealing with like altitude drops where they're going to be a little bit, heels slightly elevated upon landing. Those are, pretty, or then rebounding out of that as well. Those are probably my go-tos, and just, I'd state it to them as like, hey, we're going to do this plyometric. It's more rear foot. This is more forefoot. We're giving your body just different exposures to the different type of contacts that you might have over the course of time when you compete.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit too about the Marinovich Plyometrics or Sports Science Lab. I think they're more ubiquitous now with the Power Plus Instagram account. With it's basically all these like little fast 4-foot oriented hops on the mat. It's all super propulsive. But I think that mirrors the demands of sport very well. But at the same time, like with like what you're saying, and just coming off of thoughts with Andrew Paul and talking about like, it's ultimately that getting into more of the back half of the foot that allows like a lot more athletic things, like a step back jumper or a, change of direction. There's some injury prevention pieces, and yeah, finding ways to do that and make it athletic, So in that sense, yeah, with like the ideas on the midfoot, the full foot bounding or full foot activity for a team sport athlete who might be propulsive. I saw too. You had said you had some work. I just love what you said about the feet. Different exposures for the feet athletically, and you had an athlete doing like a bounding or some sort of bound type activity on. You said the slant of the street being beneficial there. And it's funny, I never would have, I've thought so much more about the slant of the street. I also live on a little hill. And at first I was like, not so stoked about living on a hill. It's hard to play soccer in the yard with the kids. But now I'm like, I'm going to use this hill. Like, like I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it for like all sorts of slanty stuff and slanty runs and even plyos. And when we play, me and my kids play tag, it's a really dynamic experience. So yeah, just curious your thoughts on the role of slants, slanted surfaces, and plyometrics in the way the foot operates.
Yeah. So with those, from what I recall, so maybe last summer or so, but we were doing like the old like Chris Corfus calls them the Captain Morgan hops, right? So the focus there is as you're hopping, you want to exit through the big toe. So if you think of like the street is just like crowned, so if I want to challenge, let's just say I'm working my way on a diagonal kind of up the crown, going to the right, and I'm hopping with my left foot. If I want to challenge my ability to get to the big toe, I'll start on the left side of the street and work my way to the right, if that visually makes sense. And then if they're like really, really struggling getting there, then I'll have them like start on top of the crown and then work their way down. And then that's kind of assisting them to get there. Just you're going with that kind of decline of the crown. So I think there's just a ton of different ways to get creative with that based on, what you're trying to get the athlete to do. So some of the, I think with those, at least one of those particular athletes, like when you watch toe off, it was more off of like the side of the foot as opposed to rolling through to the ball of the big toe. So that was the primary, one of the primary interventions to kind of assist with that.
Yeah, it reminds me too of like Edith Hoyce. So I think, as far as I know with the whole story of things, I'm not sure exactly how it shook out, but she was the inspiration behind a lot of like the Marinovich and eventually Sports Science Lab, and then things you see in Power Plus. And she did a lot of slant board just stuff for the foot in general, more static. Like her stuff was a lot more static and mindful, but she had different like arch uphill, arch downhill. And the most challenging, I believe, as she said, was arch downhill, where like the pinky toe side of your foot is on the high side of the street or the slant. And then the most challenge, so that was the most challenging thing, but that is like, it kind of also shoves you into the big toe, but it also stresses the fascia, the integration, the connective tissue integration that doesn't let your foot just totally bowl over either. And that does have, and there is some like, you could definitely overdo it. I've messed around. I remember one time our kids were like playing at some pond and I was bored and I was just like, and it was a pretty steep slant. So I'm like sitting here trying to run and do a single leg jump with my foot, the pinky toe side on the high side of the hill, and then the big toe side obviously barely even touching. I was like, man, when I catch this right, I feel tons of spring, like the way a high jumper catches it in takeoff. But I'm like, it's really easy to do too much too, like and almost overdo it and probably like virtually break your ankle. So, but I also think that too, that a little bit of that eversion stimulus is also something that can get you a little bit more midfoot naturally. It is more of a rear foot accessing type motion. So almost even without, this is just me this is how my mind works sometimes, Rob, I apologize. But like, instead of even saying, I'm just thinking out loud, like because I never I'm just not a fan of plyos where you're like, really get your midfoot, be flat footed. I do use it teaching bounds. I will say, teaching new athletes how to bound, I like small amplitude. Just go off your whole foot as a constraint and learn to work that. But anything that's more maximal, I tend to not like to leave those things in the system for long. And I do feel like things that are a little bit everted are also naturally more midfoot by nature without you even having to necessarily think about it. So I wonder if there's something there for like midfoot access in plyos or running that wouldn't need to be coached there. So your thing with the street made me think about that too. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and every session that we'll start with in my garage it's all like hopping and PVC stuff just to give the foot different exposure. Because if I don't do that foot stuff early on in the session, I tend to, it tends to go away because you might be doing some more things that athletes would say were exciting towards the tail end of the session. So slant board hops are a staple. PVC just balancing in different ways on the PVC, one on each foot, like you've shown many times. Those are huge in what we do.
Yeah, love the PVC pipes. Cheapest training tool of all time, too, probably.
Yeah.
Bang for buck might be the best ever. So, anyways, I think that's all the questions I had, Rob. I had a blast talking to you today. Thanks for, I think you're at the lake house right now, so enjoy your day on the lake. But I had a blast talking to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.